Hi, welcome back to our channel. We are going to discuss chapter number 3 of the book The Ending of Time. If you haven't seen the first 2 chapters, I would advise you to do so, because this is metaphysics, ontology, very sort of abstract philosophical stuff, and it'll be easier for you to follow if you start at the beginning. That said, let's jump right in. So this chapter starts out with a discussion of the rise of materialism, scientism, and reductionism, and basically man's attempt to find meaning in the physical world, so to speak. So it contrasts that with man's relationship to religion, or rather the meaning of religion, or the meaning that religion had in history. And we can summarize this beginning of the discussion in 5 hypotheses, which are: firstly, before the paradigm shift to materialism and scientism, man believed that the ground of existence was in something beyond matter. Second hypothesis is man might have merely invented something beyond the ordinary, something eternal, timeless, nameless, independent, and absolute. And the third one, this belief gave man meaning and became religion. Fourthly, with the rise of materialism and scientism, the focus shifted onto that which is observable, and the quest for deeper meaning got lost. And fifth hypothesis would be, with time, science began to deny religion because the stories told by religion were no longer plausible. Now, that of course doesn't apply to all of humanity. I mean, as we well know, there's a lot of believers out there, and I'm not trying to make any sort of value judgment at all. I'm just giving you what's in the book, really. If I interject my own thoughts, then I actually always tell you. So this is just summarizing what the 2 of them have been talking about. And I think it's easy to accept because it just sort of, shows what the broad sort of development was with, religion or faith, or one should rather say having a much, more prominent meaning in everyday life before the Enlightenment, and with the Enlightenment came the rise of science, and with the rise of science, religion was sort of put on the back burner, and with that putting the focus solely on what's observable in the physical world, religion lost its impact, so to speak, on people's lives. So that's sort of like what they start out with. The next section tries to explore man's relationship to what is called the ground. Now, please bear in mind that the term the ground was referred to that which is indescribable. In previous chapters, it was also called or we called it the ground of all being, and that which man should have access to for his life to have meaning, according to the previous chapters we discussed. So in the context of this discussion, the ground should not be equated with God, at least not with what man's general idea of God seems to have been in the past. I mean, and I think that's where this second hypothesis comes from when they say man might have merely invented something beyond the ordinary, something eternal, timeless, nameless, independent and absolute, is to give the possibility that, you know, from a scientific point of view, obviously, God could be an invention of man. So there's two questions that are posed next, and the first one is the ground indifferent to man? And the second one is, what is the relationship of this ground to man and man's relationship to it? And in trying to answer these questions, let's again summarize the ensuing discussion of the two in three hypotheses, and that would be: firstly, the ground does not seem to care whether man survives or does not survive, and that's a really strong statement. So if, you know, it contrasts the belief that there is at least in monotheism, that there is a God who actually cares about his creation, essentially. So this contrasts that starkly. And the second hypothesis is, in the past, people may have felt that God was a ground who was not indifferent to mankind, so they give it to, they give that point to history, that in the past we felt that there was a higher authority that cared about what's happening to man. And the third one is, Middle Eastern traditions of mysticism suggest that what man does has some significance to the ground. And that's an important observation as well, because I'm not a theologian, obviously, but I guess, like, from a very layman's point of view, you know, God was regarded as sort of superior authority that could act on man, but not vice versa. And here we are introducing the possibility that it's actually a two-way relationship. So, implying some type of causality. But what's really important to note is that I think, you know, this discussion of what man used to regard as God relates to his tendency to project thought, and to actually, you know, to project thought on things, you know, and to actually project agency on other people as well. So projection is a term that is a psychological term. If you're interested in finding out what it means, please Google it, because we don't have the time to expand on that in this video. So really what we're seeing here is that man has a tendency to project both responsibility, agency and judgment onto an idealized authority, in the case of God, of a higher power, which tends to be thought of as personified. And I think that's important to note as well, is that also from a layman's perspective, God, you know, historically was both, there was always a tendency to not only give God, the concept of God, a name, but also a face and a personality. And moreover, we project, or we tend to project into that higher authority that they have a vested interest in the fate of man, since man is thought to be the personified authority's creation. So here you go. Now contrast that with the possibility that there just is ground, and which is all-encompassing, and not a particular mind, which is not a particular mind, but like a universal type of mind, and that does not take sides, that is not personified, that doesn't make judgments, and that doesn't make any decisions or acts in any certain way. It just is, you know. So it's important that they, in the discussion, it's important to sort of juxtapose these positions and make room for, you know, the ensuing discussion. So next, the discussion moves to determining what demonstrability, or what the role of demonstrability is. And that really means, you know, I mean, the question that pops up is there a way to scientifically prove that the ground exists, you know? If you take all these hypotheses in mind, you know, in consideration that we've already established, you know, is there a way for man to prove that such a ground exists? And they then, you know, explore this question, and again, to sort of simplify things and to shorten them for the sake of this video, not to be too long in the end. We can again posit 4 hypotheses to that question, if there's a way to scientifically prove whether that ground exists or not. So hypothesis 1 is man would have to be willing to give up the self, to venture out, to discover the ground publicly, so that it becomes scientifically observable reality. So basically what this is saying is that, you know, that which we can only at this point coin the ground would have to become a topic of scientific discovery. Second hypothesis, that way man would be able to accept the ground as fact, not something based on illusion or belief. So by rendering the ground a subject of science, it would sort of no longer reside in this illusionary and, you know, religious sort of corner, but it would actually become part of science. Thirdly, scientists believe in their theories too, because ultimately there is no proof that observed fact exists in themselves outside of the human mind. So they're this is just to relativize, you know, the metaphysical sort of basis of science, and to point to the fact that science itself is based on basic metaphysical assumptions, and you know, might be harder to distinguish from belief and from desire than we actually would wish. So that's just to make clear that if we sort of reproach religion and faith to just be, you know, belief and wishful thinking, and if we point to science as being sort of in contrast, being exact and, you know, objective and all that kind of stuff, this sort of distinction is being relativized here. So the fourth hypothesis is facts about matter rely on theories in order to be established. I think that helps. The point that we made before is that, you know, when you observe matter, when you observe the physical and you make observations and then you posit a theory, you know, and there's a tendency that there's sort of like a circularity in a way, you know. It's like you posit a fact and then you put up a theory, and then the theory tends to prove the fact, you know. So there's a certain tendency for path dependency, if you will, if you develop any given theory. And they just point out that for something to be considered fact, we rely mostly on theories that already exist. So with regard to demonstrability and the question if there's a way to scientifically prove that the ground exists, these basic propositions were made, and it opens up, of course, a whole other discussion. But I would just take away that, well, that's my own thoughts, is that, both religion, if you look at the history of humanity from like a very far away vantage point, we could observe that both religion and science blended themselves, or gave man some meaning, equally, I guess, equally so. And they also both were or could serve as basis for decision making. I wouldn't distinguish between religion or science to be better at this. I mean, if you look to societies that, or countries, or regions that still heavily rely on religious belief for decision making, they are there, and so that's an observation. I think that is valid, really. And I think both in the case of religion and in the case of science, the stability of such a system, the stability of such a basis for decision making really depends on having a consensus, having a big enough majority to back this kind of reasoning, And one could say that consensus tends to be given as long as there is either, some kind of meaning that regular people can glean from whatever system is being established, or it tends to be given, the consensus tends to be given when it is furthering one's agenda, So, but notice that both of these require subjects, require particular minds. If we use the language of this book, particular minds to identify with their egoic structure, wanting to become something, just to hark back to the first two chapters. So there's this chasm, they open up this chasm, between religion and science, and they discuss, what each was able to do or is able to do. And I would interject that with the advent of quantum physics, this chasm seems to soften, because as we see, I think quantum physics scratches the metaphysical foundation of science as we know it. So spirituality and science tend to come closer together because of that, But maybe we should go back and to the dialogue, to the actual dialogue now, and I prepared a short excerpt to sort of, because sometimes I think it's important to actually listen to the two talk. So Bohm starts by saying, the scientists might say, yes, psychology is science which we look inwardly, with which we look inwardly to investigate the mind. And they say various people like Freud and Jung and others have had theories. Now we will have to make it clear why it has no point to make these theories. Because theory prevents the observation of what is actually taking place. Why is it that theories are both necessary and useful in organizing facts about matter outwardly, and yet inwardly, psychologically, they are in the way? They are of no use at all. Let's say that when we look at matter outwardly, to a certain extent, we fix this observing or the observing. That is, the observer is different from the observed. So, two things are being said here. There is a distinction made between observing outward facts, i.e. observing the material world, which is deemed somewhat useful, and observing the inward world, which, can be subsumed under the science of, or the soft science of psychology. And the second point that is made is that with the observing, with the act of observing, what is strengthened, or what is being strengthened, is the idea that there's a difference between the observer and the observed. Okay, so by observing, by doing science, whether you observe outward stuff or inward stuff, this idea of there being independent observers that can objectively observe something, an object or someone else, that is being this idea is being strengthened, And that's another crucial point to make, because, objectivity is one of the hallmarks of science, really. So, and one of the fundamental assumptions, or beliefs for that matter, that the observer is different from the observed, is just that. It's an assumption, and science is based on that. The whole of science is based on that concept. And over time, this basic assumption has been generally accepted as fact by a majority. There's been consensus that this is a fact, that objectivity is a possibility, where I think it should have been treated as an assumption all along. And as I said, quantum physics tends to challenge this notion of separability between observer, the act of observing, and an observed object. So let's go back to the dialogue. So that is, the observer is different from the observed. This appears to be necessary in order to study matter. Matter does not change so fast, and it can be separated to some extent. We can then make a fairly constant way of looking. It changes, but not immediately. It can be held constant for a while. Yes. And we call that theory. As you said, theory means a way of observing. it is the same as theatre in Greek. Theatre, yes, that's right. It is a way of looking. The common way of looking is full of prejudice. Yes, it's arbitrary and dependent on your background. Another thought comes in here, aside from the discussion of objectivity, there's another point made here, and that is the point of, or at least it's being alluded to, when he says that your observation is sort of tainted by your background. Well, one could really say, well, there's this tendency for cognitive biases, and I would really advise you to Google that term. It's quite an interesting topic, and there's a plethora of possible cognitive biases out there. It just helps to, when I wrote my master's thesis a couple of years ago, I had to, engage in the discussion of cognitive biases, and it was just amazing to see how many there are and how subtle they can be. So I'm gonna see if I can link to some of the literature I found at the time in the description box. So they say that theory depends on observing facts, and that it depends on the way you look or observe, and that the observation can be tainted by background or by your propensities. Next, an inquiry starts about what, if anything, can be accepted as an undeniable factor, a starting point. So if we all that said, what we said so far, we seem to be free-floating. Nothing seems to be, we can't base anything on anything anymore because we plucked it all apart. So it's kind of logical that in order to put up their own, in order to they want to sort of ground their own thinking on a solid ground. So they're now discussing, well, what, if anything, can we accept as undeniable factor? Much as Descartes did at the time when he, obviously had a different outcome because his result was cogito ergo sum. So the only thing he can be sure about is that he is because he thinks, which in light of what we're discussing right here can be questioned heavily now. But anyway, so they're looking for this undeniable factor as a starting point, and they sort of probe into various possibilities, and one of them is to say, well, basically, but man, is fundamentally, man is rational. So they discuss rationality, and they come to the conclusion that rationality cannot be assumed as a starting point, because they find all these instances where man is irrational. So one couldn't use rationality as starting point. So they discuss rationality as a sort of starting point or common denominator, but later reject it, and instead they introduce suffering as common trait. And you see the parallels to so the hypothesis we should note at this point is the common factor of man is that man suffers. And of course, you see the familiarity of that statement with the or recognize it as being one of the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy. So they're not the first to think that, you know, the common factor of man is suffering. So anyway, that said, the conversation then harks back to the initial question we set out with in chapter 1, which was where has man taken a wrong turn? I think the wrong turn was taken when thought became all important. So if we again look at things at the history of humanity, or maybe we should say the recent history of humanity, from far, far away, then that point seems to be pretty much the Enlightenment, I guess, at least in my opinion. The advent of scientism, of rationalism, and hence materialism. So two questions actually ensue from that stark statement, and that is, firstly, what made human beings enthrone thought as the only means of operation? And secondly, why does thought cause all these difficulties? And to answer, or attempt to answer, let's turn back to the dialogue. We are basically irrational because we have given thought supreme importance. So that's interesting, you know, by the very fact that we as human beings tend to, at least in recent history, put so much importance to thought, i.e. science, that is what they deem irrational. The scientist feels he is investigating the real nature of matter, independent of thought, ultimately independent anyway. He wants to know the way the universe is. He may be fooling himself, but he feels that it wouldn't be worth doing unless he believes he is finding an objective fact. So would you say that through the investigation of matter, he is trying to find something, he is trying to find the ground? That's exactly it. There seems to be a conundrum here, you know. If man thinks of himself as being rational, indeed he is irrational, you know, because he cannot begin to be rational unless he acknowledges his irrationality. And it's really hard to bring that point across, so maybe we should just go back into the actual dialogue that is trying to clear this up. The fact is, I am irrational, and to find the ground, I must become extremely rational in my life. That's all. Irrationality has been brought about by thought, creating this idea of me as separate from everybody else. So can I, being irrational, find the cause of irrationality and wipe it out? If I can't do that, I cannot reach the ground which is the most rational. The failure of rationality blocks science away. Scientists cling to their theory and they become jealous and so on. Now, there's an interesting side story, you know, to this. And I personally believe that's one of the reasons why Bohm got into this venture, you know, thinking about this in the first place, is that he suffered considerable grievances in his scientific career because he was basically ousted, you know, by colleagues for reasons we cannot discuss here, and he then had to like emigrate because he was deemed, I mean, that was in the, I believe, the McCarthy era in the US. So he was deemed communist, I believe, and so he had to emigrate, and it was a whole disaster. Of course, his contribution to quantum physics took another turn, you know, and if Bohm had been very ego-driven, which I don't think, then that could have very well destroyed him, because basically his career was hampered, you know, quite a bit, and by colleagues, you know, that were torpedoing him. So when he says that, you know, not only irrationality but jealousy, you know, when that jealousy comes in, I think he proves that he's not free of his own history, so to speak. You know, he lived through that, and it's going to influence his decision making as well. Proving a point, you know. But anyway, you can if you're interested in this backstory, you can Google it. I guess there is ample information about this on the web. So they're talking about, you know, where the irrationality comes from and all that. That's it. That is all. The irrationality overcomes them. So then you could say you might as well look at the source of the whole irrationality. That is what I'm saying. One is dominated by one's irrationality, even though there is enough rationality to discuss the question. And then you know, there's also talk about, well, one could be irrational in private life, in their private lives, but then when they go to work, they're rational. So, but they don't really come to a conclusion here. But we can have three hypotheses from this that are the common dominant factor in all our lives is thought. Thought brings about irrationality, it's the second one. And the third one, thinking is the movement of memory, which is experience, knowledge stored in the brain. You will see later why they would say that, or why they would say that at this point, because there will be a distinction made between thinking that is sort of time bound, because it, you know, it feeds itself feeds on memory, which is past experience, and on knowledge, you know, which has been gained in the past and which has been stored in the brain. It's like a self-referential kind of loop. But then they give room for thinking that is, let's say, inspired by something else, you know, and that will be discussed later. So this, it's important to put it, therefore it's important to put it as hypothesis now. So next, Krishnamurti introduces the concept of insight, see, there you go, and tries to clarify its relationship with thought. If we are completely rational, there is total insight. That insight uses thought and then is rational. And from that, we can draw another hypothesis, which is thought without insight is limited, divisive, incomplete, and can never be rational. So you see, they introduced this element of insight, and if you remember in the, I think, second chapter was, Krishnamurti talks about this experience he had, this sort of like, well, I'm not sure if you can describe it as enlightenment, but I would assume it comes close to what we call enlightenment in a human being. So that he talks about it having been instant, you know, and all-encompassing. So, and therefore he introduces insight now, which is like a movement that happens, you know, and that is not in time. So next they discuss how insight can be attained. Now, how are you to have insight which is total rationality, not the rationality of thought? I should call it rationality of perception. Yes, rationality of perception. Then thought becomes the instrument of that, so it has the same order. Now, how am I to have that insight? That is the next question, isn't it? What am I to do or not to do to have this instant insight, which is not of time, which is not of memory, which has no cause, which is not based on a reward or punishment? It is free of all that. Now, how does the mind have this insight? When I say I have insight, that is wrong, obviously. So how is it possible for a mind which has been irrational and has become somewhat rational to have that insight? It is possible to have that insight if your mind is free from time. Let's go slowly, because you see, if we go back to the scientific, even common sense point of view, implicitly time is taken as the ground of everything in scientific work. In fact, even in ancient Greek mythology, Kronos, the god of time, produces his children and swallows them. That is exactly what we said about the ground. Everything comes from the ground and dies to the ground. So in a way, mankind long ago began to take time already as the ground. Yes, and then someone comes along and says time is not the ground. That's right. So until now, even scientists have been looking for the ground in time, and everybody else too. That is the whole point. So next, they discuss the relationship between having an experience, you know, because there's this whole question of, you know, how to be free of time, pretty much. So they discuss the mechanism of what happens when a particular mind, you know, experiences, has an experience, and what happens, what sort of ensues, you know. Bohm tries to describe this mechanism as follows. The first thing that happens is a mild shock, a pain or whatever, which you identify with that shock. Then you explain it by saying, I am hurt. And that immediately implies a separation to do something about it. Of course, if I'm not hurt, I don't know anything about separation or not separation. If I am hurt, I am irrational as long as I maintain that hurt and do something about it, which is to become. Then irrationality comes in. I think that is right. So, later on in the discussion, they suggest that with the cessation of thought, pain could stop as well. Now, if you don't maintain it, what happens? The pain, he means. Suppose you say, I won't go on with this becoming in order to get away from pain. that is quite a different matter. It means I am no longer thinking, no longer observing, or using time as an observation. You could say that is not your way of looking. It is not your theory anymore. That's right. Because you could say time is a theory which everybody adopts for psychological purposes. Yes, that is the common factor. Time is the common factor of man, and we are pointing out time is an illusion. Psychological time. Of course, that is understood. Are you saying that when we no longer approach this through time, then the hurt does not continue? It does not continue, it ends, because you are not becoming anything. In becoming, you are always continuing what you are. Oh, that last statement for today, you could talk about that for hours. It's so interesting, but it makes sense. So imagine there's a particular mind that feels hurt, that wants to do something about the feeling hurt, and therefore it sets out to become something else. Now, in becoming, it continues to be what it is, a particular mind. So it's just, if you read this text by yourself, you will find that there's so much to glean from it, and that's why I suggest you read it parallel to watching these videos, of course, and maybe also listen back to the actual conversation, which there's a recording of. I will link all of this in the description box, and I will see you in the next chapter. Bye-bye.